Hello, I'm sorry. Sorry. Hello, everyone. I think I know just about all of you. A couple of new faces. Thank you all for coming. My name is Penny Wright. Before we begin, I want to just mention, I know some of you have come back from parts south and are here. We're happy you're back. We've got a lot going on this summer. In addition to we have a May-June newsletter, but also we made a couple of flyers that incorporate quite a few of our programs, writers and other special events. Now this is not everything we're doing, so when our newsletters come out, please be sure to look at them. But if you take one of this, you'll sort of have a leg up on lectures and writers events here. So I do hope you'll take that. Oh, the other thing we have on the table is flyers for the Great Decisions programs. Now, Martin Levinson, Dr. Martin Levinson, as some of you know, moderates a wonderful discussion series that we've been hosting here for next door in Cooper Hall for maybe 2.5 years, yeah. At least that. And it's a series of discussions about foreign policy, and they're very interesting talks. And so the upcoming Great Decisions conversations are listed in the flyers on the table. So we do hope you'll come to those. They get a little bit crowded in the summer, so really try to make a reservation if you do want to come to that. Anyway, we've been happy to know Martin Levinson for a number of years now, and he's been quite a frequent speaker here at the library. He's a member of the Authors Guild, the National Book Critics Circle, and he's the book editor for Etc., a review of general semantics. He has written 9 books on a wide range of topics. He's been a teacher. He's currently the president of the Institute of General Semantics, which is a think tank based in New York City. By the way, the next session of the Great Decision series will be on the rise of populism in Europe. How did they know? Because these are planned quite a little ways.
If you missed one for June 24th.
Oh, June event. Okay, so the June 24th event is, okay, now the one I was mentioning, the rise of population, is July 22nd. But you're absolutely right. There is one on June.
Nuclear negotiations.
Nuclear negotiations. And the date of that event is what?
June 24th.
June 24th. So we hope you'll join us for one of these. In the meantime, we're very happy to have him here today to talk about slavery. Please welcome Martin Levinson.
On all the great decisions, you can't go wrong with any of the topics because they're all topical. So hopefully we'll see you June 24th. Anyway, that's good. Okay. So anyway, my name is Martin Levinson. I'll be doing the talk today on slavery. What I'm going to do, the plan is I'm going to be showing a little bit of a video of the making of slavery in America. It was shown on PBS. It's a 4-part series. Did anybody here watch it? Okay, not that many. So you'll see part of it. I'm just going to show a small part of it. You can request it from the library. So if you're interested in the topic, you can request the DVD. It has 4 episodes. The 4 episodes run about 190 minutes. I'm going to show you 10. So it's like a whet your appetite for it. And I'll talk about slavery in America, and then we can have some Q&A. By the way, the reason I'm doing the lecture right now is the 400th anniversary first slave brought to America. I think it'll be a big deal, but I don't see much advertising about it. Certainly Donald Trump's not mentioning it. So at any event, let's see the video. So this is the second episode, by the way, so just to give you a taste.
Yvette, let's just put all the inside lights on. Right. Yeah, good. Super, thanks.
City, 1741.
A little bit, yeah.
Quack. enslaved to a house painter, approached Fort George, the seat of British colonial rule in New York, and home to the governor.
Quack was married to the governor's cook, a slave. The governor did not like Quack's behavior and did not like when Quack came visiting. And the governor gave orders to the fort sentries that if Quack should appear, he should not be allowed entry. Quack uttered certain implications that he would burn the place down, but he would be with his wife. When the fort did subsequently burn down, Quack was a prime suspect.
When fires erupted in a number of other buildings, warehouses, and stores, it was clear that this was more than romance thwarted.
The cry went up, the Negroes are rising, the Negroes are rising.
Rumors of slaves organizing rebellion traveled the Atlantic seaboard. 2 years earlier, in an uprising of slaves in Stono, South Carolina, some whites were murdered. Now, white New Yorkers panicked.
Almost every adult black male who was over 14 years of age was picked up by the city constables, by the militia, and placed in jail.
As the inquiries began, Caesar, slave of a baker, was the first to be marched to the gallows. His body would hang in a public space while a conspiracy trial accused dozens of slaves and a few whites of plotting to burn down New York City and foment slave rebellion. The trial revealed bitter details about the lives of the enslaved in New York, home to the second largest slave population after Charleston, South Carolina.
There was a sense among all of these slaves that they were trapped into a system that offered no yield at all, that there was nothing that they could do if they wanted to be free except to revolt.
Slaves complained about being overworked and that they weren't supplied with enough clothing or fuel to keep warm. They lashed out at the laws that prohibited them from gathering together. But their most common complaint was not being allowed to visit their loved ones.
In the mid-18th century, African Americans in New York knew that liberty existed for others. They knew it was denied to them.
As slaves faced the court, they were confronted by all the laws that had accumulated over the past 100 years, restricting and degrading their lives.
The law of slavery deemed that persons who were patently human beings were not in fact persons. They were not persons at law. Rather, they were deemed property. Well, that is a patent fiction. Anyone can look at Caesar, at Quack, and say, well, yes, these are persons. And much of slaves' existence was geared to the fact of demonstrating their humanity.
Early in the proceedings, Quack was accused of burning down Fort George. He and 12 other black men were burned at the stake. 17 were hanged. 4 whites were also hanged.
After each rebellion, what the society seeks to do is pass a more repressive set of laws. And so we have a continually upward cycling of violence, because the violence of slaveholder repression produces the violence of slavery action.
By the 1750s, some 5,000 Africans a year were brought to American docks in crowded, filthy, stinking ships.
And for weeks, they are confined to these places, people being chained together. people dying and being chained to dead people for periods of time until somebody decides to take the dead people above decks and throw them into the ocean.
Some people didn't last 2 weeks, but for other people, they began mustering the human resources that it would take to figure out the predicament they had been thrown into. The planters, the exploiters, have rationalized what they're doing. They've worked it out with the law. They've worked it out with their God one way or another. And they've begun the long trek into American racism. That is to say, they have reduced these people to less than human beings, and that's the way they're going to make it work.
100 years after the first Africans arrived, most colonies were heavily dependent upon slave labor. By 1750, 250,000 enslaved blacks now made vast wealth possible for their masters.
Slavery, it seems to me, was an extraordinary goose that laid the golden egg. You had workers that you didn't have to pay, and you owned their children as soon as they were born. It's a preposterous system. All you have to do is visit one of the huge plantations in Virginia or South Carolina to see the wealth that flowed.
At Shadwell, a tobacco plantation in the Piedmont region of Virginia, two young boys are growing up together. Jupiter was born a slave. The other, Thomas Jefferson, would one day be president of a new republic. Jupiter was one of more than 60 slaves who sustained Jefferson's family.
A new generation of black people, of slaves, is coming of age. These are people who are born on this side of the Atlantic. These are people who know how to operate within the society.
When Thomas Jefferson went off to study the classics, Jupiter was trained to be Jefferson's personal valet. That training would include sophisticated lessons in psychology and power.
Certainly, as he grew up, one of the things that he was going to have to learn is that a boy who is his same age, Thomas Jefferson, is going to grow up to be his owner, is going to grow up to be his master.
He came to understand something about the politics of that world. The word liberty, of course, would come to be used much in the years that followed, and his own owner, Thomas Jefferson, became a great merchant of the language of liberty. Jupiter understood that as well.
Jupiter's status and work conditions were privileged compared to most other slaves at Shadwell. But for all of them, including Jupiter, it would be endless work from sunup to sundown and beyond.
All of them also would have experienced a punishment. The cutting off of ears, the kind of contraptions that are placed around people to prevent running away. All of these torturous weapons are realities that enslaved people everywhere would have experienced.
Jupiter, like any child, would also have to deal with the fact that while his parents have authority over him, their authority is secondary to the authority of the slave owner. He might have to witness his mother being schooled by her owner. He would have to watch his mother being punished, being whipped, or being raped.
In this lopsided balance of power, slaves found ingenious ways to resist the master. Some subtle, some overt, some suicidal.
Arson was one of the primary forms of resistance because it was hard to track. Poisoning was another. Running away was another because you were literally stealing property from the master if you ran away.
A runaway ad in 1746 describes 16-year-old Stephen thusly. He has been much whipped, which his back is shown. Another ad describes Peter as Virginia-born, running away with iron shackles on his legs.
day after day, slaves are refusing to obey. They are saying, listen, we have our own lives. We will not go that far. We will not submit totally.
Slave and master knew each other well. Using this familiarity, slaves constantly tested the boundaries. They negotiated with their masters for more time to work on their own gardens or to sell and trade produce they cultivated.
It would seem that somebody who's a slave would have no power and it would have nothing to negotiate. But slaves found that they could negotiate. They danced the dance of domination and subordination.
One of the most profound forms of resistance was the preservation of African religions, values, and beliefs.
What it did is create an internal universe which is separate and apart from and beyond the control of a white master.
Yet, something else was emerging.
The first generation of American-born descendants of Africans are really in the process of creating something that has a very strong link to Africa, but which is really quite new.
On plantations, new African arrivals mixed with American-born slaves to shape a new culture.
The Jefferson family may have a violin from Europe, and someone plays that fiddle. Jupiter's family from Africa knows how to make banjos. In fact, Thomas Jefferson himself writes about how the banjo is an African instrument. Originally in Africa, they often made it using a big gourd. So this complicated coming together of different cultures, not just Europe and Africa, but varieties of West African cultures. On any given plantation, any given young person like Jupiter is experiencing all these forces.
For Jupiter, growing to adulthood, it was a double life. When Jefferson went off to college in Williamsburg, Jupiter accompanied him as his valet. When Jefferson went to court his future wife at her father's plantation, Jupiter would find his future wife enslaved there. They would all end up at Monticello, Jefferson's mansion in rural Virginia. As slaves began forming extended families, the slave quarter became the center of family life.
They, like any other human beings, free or unfree, 1,000 years ago or today, have the emotions of any other people. They fall in love, they hate others, they develop friendships, and how to do this within the milieu of slavery simply made those very human realities more difficult and more challenging, but they existed.
Networks of love and affection and connection between the enslaved have got to be really crucial to surviving the experience of slavery, to surviving it on an emotional level as well as a physical level.
But in the creation of those families, it gave their owners yet another weapon to force them to behave in the ways that they wanted.
What this community then becomes is the foundation for an internal slave trade where these children and these families will be separated in the future.
It's almost unimaginable the tragedy of seeing next of.
So that's just a smattering, obviously, it goes on and on. I think it's very well done. And you can see New York, obviously, slavery second to Charlottesville in the early 1700s. All right, so anyway, I'm going to do my talk now. It's 22 minutes. Whoever wins, they give you 22 minutes, give you the world. You give them 22 minutes, they'll give you the world. So you give me 22 minutes, I'll give you Slavery and the Making of America. By the way, you can get this PBS DVD, I guess, from the library. If they don't have it here, you know, they can get it from another Suffolk library. All right. James Madison called slavery America's original sin. Tom Paine was completely against the institution of slavery and wanted to free all the slaves in the United States. Thomas Jefferson, who we just saw in the DVD, said slavery's horrors will bring down a wrath of biblical proportions. Jefferson also, as you know, had an affair with the slave Sally Hemings when she was 15 and fathered children by her. The Atlantic slave trade began in 1441 when Prince Henry of Portugal sent a ship to West Africa to bring back a cargo of sealskins and oil. The captain also decided to bring back black captives. This episode marked the beginning of an era of European exploration that brought the continents of Europe and Africa into contact with each other through the forced transatlantic migrations from Africa to Europe and eventually to the Caribbean and to North and South America. Before 1600, probably no more than a few 100,000 Africans were taken to the Americas. In the 17th century, however, demand for slave labor rose sharply with the growth of sugar plantations in the Caribbean and tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake region of North America. The largest numbers of slaves were taken to the Americas during the 18th century when, according to the historians' estimates, nearly 3/5 of the total volume of the transatlantic slave trade took place. The first slaves were brought to the United States in 1619. Around 20 were given to the governor of Virginia by Dutch traders who took them from a Spanish slave ship bound for South America. The governor treated them as indentured servants. 11 years later, in 1630, a Virginia court sentenced Hugh Davis, a white man, to be punished for defiling his body by copulating with a Negro. As we shall see a little bit later, the injunction against white men sleeping with black women would be turned on its head with the advent of slavery. In 1640, a Virginia court sentenced John Punch, who was an indentured black man, who was fleeing his servitude with two white men, to slavery. The whites with him got some additional time added to their indenture. This was the first legal sanctioning of slavery and distinctions between blacks and Europeans. In 1641, Massachusetts became the first colony to enact slavery into law. During the colonial period, slavery existed in all the colonies. People enslaved in the North typically worked as house servants, artisans, laborers, and craftsmen, with the greatest number in cities. Many men worked on the docks and in shipping. In 1703, more than 42% of New York City households held slaves, the second highest percentage of any city in the colonies after Charleston, South Carolina. Slaves were also used as agricultural workers in farm communities, including in areas of upstate New York, Long Island, Connecticut, and New Jersey. In 1662, a Southern court ruled that all children born in the United States got their status from their mother. This was contrary to English common law, where status was derived from the father, which meant that white men could sleep with black women, and the children that were born from these assignations would be slaves. In 1669, Virginia enacted a law that said it was not murder for an owner to kill a slave while punishing him. The rationale being that because time could not be added to the service of people who were already slaves for life, sometimes only violence could correct obstinate behavior, and if such violence resulted in death, so be it. During the 1700s, slavery was as customary as prisons are today, and a myth grew up of the strong black woman and the weak white woman. Black women were thought to aggressively pursue white men, while white women were seen as at the mercy of hypersexed black men. One result of this was that from 1728 to 1776, no rapes of black women were reported. Slavery kept the majority of poor whites poor, but at least culturally they could feel superior to the black slaves. Indeed, many white people, including Thomas Jefferson, thought blacks were inferior to whites in reason, and that blacks were basically best suited for physical labor. John Calhoun, who served as vice president in the John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson administrations, also subscribed to that philosophy and called slavery a positive good. Robert Boyle, who was known as the father of chemistry, said black skin was a deformity of whiteness. Crispus Attucks, a black man who historians disagree about whether he was a slave or not, was the first person killed in the Revolutionary War in the Boston Massacre of 1770. 6 years later, the Declaration announced that all men are created equal, but that certainly did not apply to men who were black slaves. Some southern state constitutions had provisions in them that read, all freedmen are created equal. It has been estimated that 5,000 black soldiers fought in the Revolutionary War. Washington was initially against using them as soldiers, but relented and said when the war was over they should be granted freedom, which, as we know, did not happen. Instead, a 3/5 voting clause was put into the Constitution, which gave the South extra representation in Congress. This extra representation increased the power of the southern states in Congress and allowed the South to dominate the U.S. presidency for nearly 50 years. Immediately after the Revolutionary War, abolition laws were passed in most northern states, and a movement developed to abolish slavery, which I will talk about later. In 1793, Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin greatly increased the demand for slave labor. In 1807, the Slave Trade Act was passed that banned the importation of slaves to the United States. But it was not enforced, and even if it had been, the slaves were already in the United States, and they were reproducing in numbers sufficient to keep the enterprise going. In 1831, Nat Turner, an enslaved African-American preacher, led the most significant slave uprising in American history. He and his band of followers launched a short, bloody rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia. The militia quelled the rebellion, and Turner was eventually hanged. As a consequence, Virginia instituted much stricter slave laws. Slaves were often bought at auction, and at these auctions, families were frequently broken up. Light-skinned young girls were sold openly for sexual use, their price being much higher than that of field hands. Special markets for the, in quotes, fancy girl trade existed in New Orleans and Lexington, Kentucky. The slaves in the South worked on harvesting rice, tobacco, cotton, and sugar, and they were subject to slave codes that made it a crime to teach a slave to read or write, and prohibited slaves from associating in large groups. Proponents of slavery often defended the institution as a necessary evil, and that its elimination would have more harmful social and economic consequences than its continuance. Robert E. Lee wrote in 1856 that he considered slavery a moral and political evil, but the blacks living in America are immeasurably better off than in Africa, morally, physically, and socially. And he thought the, in quotes, painful discipline they were undergoing was necessary for the further instruction of their race and would prepare them for better things. The treatment of slaves varied widely depending on conditions, times, and places. The power relationships of slavery corrupted many whites who had authority over slaves, with children showing their own cruelty. Masters and overseers resorted to physical punishments to impose their wills. Slaves were punished by whipping, shackling, hanging, beating, burning, mutilation, branding, and imprisonment. Punishment was most often meted out in response to disobedience or perceived infractions, but sometimes abuse was carried out to assert the domination of the master or overseer over the slave. Treatment was usually harsher on large plantations, which were often managed by overseers and owned by absentee slaveholders. 3/4 of the families in the South owned no slaves. In the North, by 1805, every northern state had abolished slavery using a gradualist approach. And as the U.S. expanded during the 19th century, questions rose as to whether the new states would be slave states or free states. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 allowed Missouri to come into the Union as a slave state and Maine to come into the Union as a free state, and set a dividing line between slave states and free states. But the Missouri Compromise eventually failed as more states came into the Union, and it was repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. 3 years later, in 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court, in the Dred Scott decision, declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. In that decision, which ruled that slaves are property and do not go free when they go to a free state, Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote that the Founding Fathers believed that blacks had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. The first half of the 19th century marked the beginning of an abolitionist movement. Some prominent examples from that movement include Henry Clay, who along with others formed the American Colonization Society, which moved thousands of free blacks to Liberia. Preacher William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of the abolitionist paper The Liberator, who called slavery a personal sin and demanded that slaveholders repent and start the process of emancipation. John Brown, who with 21 of his followers raided a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry to initiate a slave revolt. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, should also mention slave Frederick Douglass, who advocated on behalf of slaves, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was the second best-selling book of the 19th century after the Bible, pushed against slavery. As the West opened up, the South wanted to be more slaveholding states to keep a balance in Congress. To appease the South in its desire to see slavery perpetuated, Congress in 1850 passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which required that states cooperate in returning runaway slaves. The Fugitive Slave Act was the impetus for the writing of Uncle Tom's Cabin. There were 4 million slaves in America, and 80% of America's GDP was tied to slavery in 1860. That same year, the Republican platform talked about stopping slavery's expansion. And when Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election, 11 southern states seceded from the Union. With the firing on Fort Sumter, the Civil War began. 178,000 blacks fought for the Union during the Civil War in over 160 units, as well as more in the Navy and in support positions. Nearly 40,000 of them died in the conflict. 3/5 of black soldiers were former slaves. The North's Commander-in-Chief, Abraham Lincoln, was more in favor of preserving the Union than abolishing slavery. In 1862, he told 5 black leaders who he called to the White House that they should convince blacks to leave the U.S. because, in quotes, "but for your race among us, there could not be war." He wanted black people to go to Panama. There was lots of opposition to the Civil War, with numerous people in the North and South saying they had a right to be independent. Many Northern workers were fearful that if slavery was abolished, their jobs might be taken by free black slaves. During the Civil War, there were draft riots in New York City, which resulted in the killings of 120 people, most of them black. The New York City draft riots remain the largest civil and racially charged insurrection in American history, aside from the Civil War itself. On January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. My tie has the Emancipation Proclamation on it, which freed slaves in the southern states, but not in the border states, as slavery was still allowed by the Constitution. It would take the 13th Amendment, which was passed after the war, to free all the slaves. After the Civil War, 3 constitutional amendments were passed dealing with black rights. They are the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery in all the states, the 14th Amendment, which established birthright citizenship and gave due process to citizens, and later, as part of a U.S. Supreme Court decision, to corporations. And the 15th Amendment, which extended voting rights but allowed the states to determine eligibility. Had that not happened, we wouldn't have all the arguments about suppression of votes, that the federal government would be the ones to determine eligibility, but the 15th Amendment allows states to determine eligibility, which in my opinion is a mistake. Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat who resented rich whites from the South, but did not believe in black equality, became Lincoln's successor when Lincoln was assassinated. Johnson allowed former Southern leaders to get back into politics, and he ignored it when blacks were terrorized by white Southerners, including some from the Ku Klux Klan, which was founded sometime between 1865 and 1866, and by 1870 would turn into the military arm of the Democratic Party. Now, you have to remember back then that the Democrats, it wasn't like today Democrats and Republicans. In a way, this was a reversal. The Democrats, well, I won't get into the total thing, but if you're confused, just think that Lincoln was the one who established the Republican Party, and the Democrats were the ones in control of the South. So that may help. Johnson helped to keep blacks from receiving abandoned and confiscated white property, saying that plantations should be given to poor white farmers. He also vetoed the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, which guaranteed blacks equal treatment in public accommodations, public transportation, and being excluded from jury duty. Sadly for him, Congress overrode his veto and made the Civil Rights Bill the first major bill in the history of the United States to become law through an override of a presidential veto. Later, the House of Representatives, frustrated by Johnson's opposition to congressional reconstruction, filed impeachment charges against Andrew Johnson. That action failed by just 1 vote in the Senate. Johnson laid the groundwork for the eventual end of Reconstruction, which would bring with it, among other things, the lynchings of thousands of blacks. According to the Tuskegee Institute, 3,446 blacks were lynched between 1882 and 1968. Mississippi had the highest rate of lynchings with 581. Georgia was second with 531, and Texas was third with 493. During Reconstruction, federal troops went into the South, but Southerners were able to pass Jim Crow laws and black codes, which kept blacks from testifying in court, entering into contracts, being subject to strong restrictions on sharecropping, and being subject to convict leasing, which is the renting of prisoners for work. Reconstruction ended with the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, who in a deal made with Southern politicians pulled federal troops out of the South in return for their support in guaranteeing the election of 1876, one of the most disputed presidential elections in American history. During Reconstruction, 90% of the blacks living in Mississippi registered to vote. In 1896, when Reconstruction had ended, 6% of blacks were registered in Mississippi, and it stayed that way till the 1960s. Also in 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal treatment for African Americans was constitutionally permitted. That idea was overturned 58 years later in the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case, but segregated schools are still the norm in many places in the United States. Black voting rights are also still an issue, as are what to do about Confederate war monuments, high rates of black imprisonment, a huge increase in one-parent black families, police killings of black men, and polling that shows racism remains a major problem in America. George Santayana famously said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." With respect to the poor treatment black people have received in America, I, for one, hope that's not going to forever be the case. So that's my 22 minutes, was probably even fair, well, about 22 minutes. So now you know more about slavery, and I'm guessing the 98% of Americans do. But anyway, before I take questions, let me recommend some additional sources for information about the subject of American slavery. Here are 4 books you may want to look at. One is Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington. It's a library, you get the book. This book just came out and had very good reviews. The next one that I'm going to mention, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. Excellent book. Third book is The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism by Edward E. Baptist. Remember I told you in 1860 how much of the GDP was because of slavery. And for a quick read, an overview of the history of slavery, you might want to look at American Slavery, A Very Short Introduction by Heather Andrea Williams. 3 places to visit. If you're in Washington, I recommend visiting the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is part of the Smithsonian. And that's a wonderful museum. If you're in Washington, you really should visit it. And if you're in Montgomery, Alabama, who knows, visit the Legacy Museum, From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration. That's the subtitle. And finally, closer to home in New York City, you can take the New York City Slavery and Underground Railway Tour, which you can book online by Googling Inside Out Tours and clicking on the Underground Railway Tour. So with that, I will take any questions that you may have or comments. Yes?
I have a comment and I have a question. My question is, what do you think about unlimited immigration that's coming to the United States now? Sort of like diluting the black African American power. In other words, the power structure in the United States is such that, you know, like Europeans, they want that. So this way, the power of even African Americans, you know, retain their rights. The unlimited immigration, low-skill immigration actually damage the African American and from economic point of view.
It's an interesting question. I'm really not an expert on this. On immigration, I mean, that's a complicated topic that really doesn't have much to do with slavery. I mean, slavery basically, you could argue, is over, although the outcomes of slavery, you know, what happened, Reconstruction happened right after the Civil War. And the idea is they were going to reconstruct the nation. The nation was broken. And what happened after the war, had Lincoln lived, we really don't know what would have happened, but the evidence is that he would have been pretty lenient with the Southerners. You know, they talk about the Confederate War monuments. That's one of the things I brought up here. Well, the Confederate War monuments were not put up after the Civil War, right after the Civil War. And the reason is, the South lost the war. The North wasn't going to let them put up monuments to their leaders who, you could argue, and I would argue, were treasonous. I mean, the definition of treason is armed insurrection against the government. That's the perfect definition of what the Southern generals were. They were leaders of an armed insurrection. And had you had a strong president, I think they could easily be tried as war criminals and executed. But instead, Lincoln, I think, would have been lenient because he wanted to bring the nation together. Had he had trials and executed them, there might have been another rebellion, so it probably wouldn't be a good move. Just like in World War II, we didn't go after the Japanese emperor and try him as a war criminal because of what would happen in Japan. But with the monuments, they really weren't built right after the Civil War or during Reconstruction. When the troops went out, the North kind of got tired of what was going on in the South and didn't bother. And so most of these monuments were built in the 1890s and early 1900s as a way for the South to say, look, you know, we really venerate what our generals did down here, and the black people down here are just going to learn to, you know, we can't keep them as slaves, but it's the next best thing. They're going to have to see our great generals and our great leaders. And the North, at this stage, were busy with other things. Capitalism reared its head after Reconstruction. People were interested in making money than enforcing civil rights. So that's basically what happened. So these monuments went up. And so that's probably one of the big issues now, is what should be done with these monuments. But also the voter suppression that's still going on, directed at black people. That's the legacy of slavery. You know, during the times of slavery, in many of the states, you were not allowed to teach a black person to read or write. And so what they did is to have you vote, they would say, take a literacy test. Well, great, you never learn to read or write, you're going to fail the test. And so that's another way that they try to keep black folks down. So there's lots of issues where slavery, of course, is not officially the policy, but there's lots of ways that you can still keep black people down in this country. And it's because of what happened during slavery, which is really not taught enough. And as I mentioned before, this is the 400th anniversary of the first slave in 1619. You'd think there'd be lots of news about it, publicity about it. I haven't seen it on television. Not that big a deal.
The only place it is a big deal, it seems people are talking about reparations. And that becomes a political volleyball, shall we say, the term is.
That's a good term.
That's a good term?
Well, I think so, because the volleyball in the sense of people are hitting it over the net for reparations, and the ones who don't want it are hitting it
I don't
back.
hear anybody saying that they don't want reparations. I think that what I hear amongst the Democratic candidates who are talking about it,
Yes.
obviously, is that they want a study, which is not really being for it. It's being for a study, and it's sort of ambiguous how they would decide on that. But what kind of reparation can one make to people that were oppressed for so long in this country?
That's a good question. Well, reparations.
Are we talking money?
Well, that's one thing you can talk about. Some people are talking money reparations, where they say, you know, slavery was bad. There should be money reparations to the people who didn't live during slavery, but their forebears, and it would say something about apologizing to the country in terms of money. You should give them money. That's, when polling that I've read, it's not a very popular position. And I think probably, my personal thought, it's probably not a good idea. Because even if you would argue it's morally right, I think what would happen is you would anger so much of the population, you would make race relations worse.
Yeah.
But there's another form of reparations you could argue in terms of affirmative action. You could argue in a way it's reparations because of all the bad stuff that was done to black people, they should get a leg up in terms of employment or in terms of college. So you could argue in a sense not money reparations, but reparations in that sense. Now when a person says we're going to do a study, I mean they just don't want to deal with it and hoping it goes away until they're elected and then it'll really go away. But that's a very good point about reparations, and that's obviously something you don't hear about much, but it comes up occasionally.
I wanted to go back to suggest a reason that perhaps why the Southern generals and military leaders were not punished. That is, a lot of them came out of West Point, and in 1841, they all fought together against the Mexicans.
That's right.
So they were all friends.
That's right.
And it also should be remembered that Abraham Lincoln asked Robert E. Lee to head up the Northern Army.
He did.
And he refused to do it
That's
because
true.
he came from Virginia. So it's a very complicated situation. And on the topic of reparations,
That's
well,
true.
let's not forget the American Indian.
That's true.
They took their land from us.
Absolutely. And that comes up occasionally too, where you hear about we should give Native Americans reparations. So absolutely right. And you're right about the generals. Many of them fought in the Mexican War, and they were friends. But whether they were friends or not, the president could have legally gone against it. But you're right. I think for the good of the country, I don't think it would have happened because of the good of the country. You're right.
How about the families of the Japanese who were interned during the war? I mean, you could go on and on about
Right.
groups of people that were treated terribly.
You could. And many people do. Not many, some.
But Japanese got something back from Reagan, right? President Reagan. So I think every person got that $20,000 in 1988.
Yeah, I think those, right, but were those direct?
Direct, yeah.
Direct. See, the problem with slavery is you don't have the direct, right? Because they're dead. So you'd have to have descendants down the line. And so that makes it more complicated. If slavery was over, 10 years ago, then it would be a different conversation, I suspect. Yes?
Two things. One, it should be known that the British in the Revolutionary War induced slaves to come to the British side, that they would get freedom. But when the British lost, they abandoned the slaves as they come over. The second thing I want to mention is that I didn't hear anything said about Grant and his role both during the war in trying to reintegrate or make it possible to reintegrate the soldiers into the Union, and so that the terms were, I wouldn't say favorable, but were not draconian. And he was also active in the Reconstruction afterwards, and was very upset when Johnson didn't support the Reconstruction.
Good points, yeah, that's right. Grant actually was president after Johnson. And Grant kept the federal troops in the South. And so that was a good thing. We mentioned Rutherford B. Hayes. I mean, we think elections are nuts now. Read about the 1876 election. I mean,
What happened then?
well, basically what happened then is Rutherford B. Hayes was running on the Republican Party. It looked like he lost the election. But at the last moment, they had 3 southern states that the votes, they said, were in doubt. Although it didn't look like they were in doubt. Samuel Tilden was a Democrat, and he had won the election. But then at the last minute, they said, no, these 3 southern states, the votes are in doubt. And so they went into meetings with the Democrats and Republicans went into meetings. They basically cut a deal. And the deal was, we'll give Hayes the presidency if you pull the federal troops if Hayes will pull the federal troops out of the South. So that was sort of called a corrupt bargain. And so that's basically what happened. The 3 states, I mean, who knows, talk about vote counting now, it's crazy, pretty bad in the 19th century. So basically the 3 states, the votes went for Hayes. He became president, and one of the first things he did as presidency is pull the federal troops out of the South. And once the troops were gone, the Southerners who were there kind of ran, they enforced whatever they did with the local people, which were good for the blacks. So that was pretty much the end of Reconstruction.
Are there newspapers now in the South that promote segregation, sort of sub rosa?
Well, there are conservative papers in the South, many of them.
Still?
Oh yeah, I mean, the South is still a pretty conservative area of the country, sure. Yeah.
In this debate, I'm just wondering if maybe England has gotten off pretty easily, considering that through the 17th century and the first half of the 18th century, when the first slaves were arriving on North American soil, and technically the country was under, the colonies were part of England. And even like with the formation of the American government after the Revolution, I mean, it was based to some degree on the English form of government, documents that had their roots there. I mean, I can't say that I'm too widely read on this subject, but it doesn't seem like I'm hearing a lot about England and its role in this as well. I wanted to hear your thoughts.
Well, England had slavery. England got rid of slavery in the early 19th century. And one of the reasons England didn't throw in with the South was that many of the people in England were against slavery. And they were thinking, should we go with the South, should we not go with the South? But there was a lot of public opinion against slavery. And England had abolished slavery in the early 19th century. So,
but then again, there's the economic side where they needed the southern cotton to run their mills and stuff.
They did.
So, I mean, it almost seems like they're not coming out of this really clean either.
They were businessmen.
Yeah.
Right.
No
Well-
different than a lot of the southern plantation owners, really. They were in it to make money.
Well, that's true of the North also. I mean, a lot of people in the North didn't want to fight in the Civil War, and you had draft riots here. And a lot of Northern workers felt, wow, you know, Civil War, blacks are free, come to the North, be cheap labor, they'll be fighting for my job. So a lot of Northerners were against Lincoln going into the Civil War. And Lincoln was lucky to get elected the second time. It was only because the fortunes of war changed, so it looked like the North was going to win. Had the South given the North a couple of bad beatings right before the election, Lincoln would have lost that election. And the President Meade would have come in, and he would have basically said, let's make peace with the South.
We wouldn't have lost Lincoln.
That's true. Well, he wouldn't have been president,
Yeah, well,
but that's true. He would have probably not been assassinated.
Actually, the Republican Convention, I believe, if I remember right, is being held in Baltimore in 1864. Lincoln did not have any opposition, but the battlefield situation began to change because
Right.
Grant was then the supreme commander of all the Union armies. And he actually, though he did not beat Lee at the Wilderness of Spotsylvania,
Right.
he forced Lee back and down and into a besieged position at Richmond. With one exception, and this is something that really probably anybody really knows that much about, Grant foolishly attacked a place called Pearl Harbor, and there was a huge massacre of federal troops. He didn't have to do that, and he did. He actually was ordered not to let any knowledge of this massacre or this really almost defeat get out, so that the delegates in Baltimore might not be nominated. It was almost a defeat of Grant's investiture of Richmond.
Yeah.
Grant luckily managed to get around that and then cross over and come around at Petersburg, and then Lee was lost. The Southern cause was lost at a point when you did not have Lee's army being able to be moved. There was no more Gettysburg, no more Antietam's.
Well, basically, the League lost in many ways because no matter what would happen to the North, no matter how bad Grant was getting beaten, he wasn't retreating. So the idea was no matter how many people were getting killed, Grant was going in the same direction, and eventually he'd win because there were so many more Northern soldiers. So that was the strategy, and it worked. Good point.
And Grant also was the architect of the victories in the West.
Right.
So basically, you can put on one hand or half of one hand the Southern victories in the West. In the East, they had a lot of victories.
They did.
But you ask yourself the question, in the Battle of Antietam, the problems that you had there, which is essentially a draw, had Grant been the commander of that battle, that would have ended the war in the East because he was defeated. Robert E. Lee.
Yes.
You mentioned about federal troops coming out from the South and the North, but I think the federal government actually left relative bases left in Fort Benning in Georgia on the South Carolina to keep an eye on the South. Even to this day, you have military bases that actually comes from the South, deployed overseas. So I think the federal government had that in mind, because they've been trusted the South 100% to have another civil war.
Well, they basically took most of the troops out. Yes.
I have a question. You mentioned in your talk, 1703, that there was 42% of New Yorker families had slaves.
Right.
That's pretty astonishing because
Yeah.
you do think that it's the southern states
Right.
versus the northern. How did they get to New York? From the south? Underground? How did the slaves come up? To
Well-
be so, so many in New York?
Well, I think a lot of the slaves also came in through New York Harbor.
Oh, through the harbor?
Absolutely. They were coming in everywhere. I mean, we don't, you think about
Ellis
slaves.
Island.
No, not Ellis Island. But it's around, just directly the harbor. Lots of immigrants were coming through the harbor. Slave ships too were coming through the harbor. We don't think of slavery in the North, which is, of course, the South was in the Civil War. But what was the first state that had slavery? Massachusetts. So, and Long Island, there were slaves here. So it's an interesting topic, yes.
How was slavery in the North different from the South?
Well, in South you had the cotton crops and tobacco crops, so you didn't have that up here. So you had more slaves, personal slaves. We had slaves in the field. I guess in Long Island they must have been doing potatoes or whatever. I'm not from here, but I guess whatever out here they were doing it. I guess less agriculture, maybe more personal slaves, household slaves.
Was it more brutal? Was it brutal up here in the north? Or, for lack of a better word, a little more civilized? They didn't separate families, that sort of thing.
Well, I'm not totally sure, but I think they probably didn't care about whether families were together or not. The idea is, you thought of a slave not as a person, but as a property. Now, that's not to say that some of the slave owners didn't become attached to the slaves and really develop affection for them, not only sexual affection, friendly, filial, some kind of affection. So not all the slave owners were like, terrible people, but many of them were. And just the idea that you have the opportunity to be like that with another person is pretty bad, but I don't know.
My husband said, what was it?
The earlier question about the British and slavery, I thought to myself, they didn't need Negro slaves and the Irish.
Okay. Sounds reasonable. Okay, last question. Yes.
So if you want to read more about that subject, read about the triangular trade. It talks about the economics of how sugar and rum went to England, and then England sent textiles and whatever trade didn't have African, and Africans couldn't use it, just recycled the ships. And they brought the slaves over, and they had auction houses in Philadelphia, Massachusetts.
Yeah. Good point.
You alluded to the fact, you alluded to something, and I just wanted to sound you out on this. Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln, his primary goal was to keep the Union intact.
Right.
And he said on more than one occasion that it didn't make any difference to him whether he freed the slaves, didn't free the slaves,
Right.
freed half the slaves or not.
Right.
His arm was twisted by Fremont. And General Fremont went to Missouri and, quote, freed the slaves.
Right.
That's when Lincoln was forced to produce the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves in
The border states.
In the border states,
Right.
like Tennessee, Louisiana, et cetera, et cetera. There were
Maryland,
10 states that the slaves were
Right.
not free in.
Right.
They were only free in the states that were still
Fighting.
hostile.
Right.
Abraham
I can't
Lincoln
believe it, or
was,
it wouldn't have been written so beautifully.
Abraham Lincoln was a terrible bigot. If you read his speeches, he did not like black people. He said that they were inferior to whites. They should not intermarry whites. They shouldn't be allowed to vote. They shouldn't be allowed to, et cetera, et cetera. He really didn't care about them, and he didn't want to send them back to.
Well, I mentioned about going back to Panama, so there's other mitigating factors, but I guess the time is up, so you'll have to read it and decide on your own. Anyway, you've been a great audience. I want to thank you.
Marty, this was a wonderful talk.
Thank